The previous owner made only one request before we signed the closing papers. He didn't ask me to take care of the house. He didn't ask me to keep the furniture. He didn't ask me to call if I ever decided to sell. Instead, he slid the keys across the table, looked me straight in the eyes, and quietly said, "Whatever you do, don't remove the dock." I laughed. The dock looked like it had survived every storm the lake had ever seen. The boards had faded almost silver with age. Several leaned under their own weight, and one railing tilted so far toward the water I didn't even want to touch it. I was planning to rebuild it. I know. Then what's the problem? Build a new one beside it if you want. He paused just long enough for the room to grow quiet. Just don't tear this one out. There was something about the way he said it that made me stop smiling. Not fear, not nostalgia, conviction. Like he had repeated those exact words in his head for years. I promised I'd remember. Only then did he let go of the keys. 4 months later, Walter Green was dead. By then, I had already heard the exact same warning from almost everyone living on the lake. My name is Daniel Brooks. I was 41 when this happened, and after my divorce I wanted only one thing, a place where nobody knew who I was. Working remotely as a structural engineer gave me that freedom. After selling the house outside Birmingham, I started looking for somewhere quieter. I wasn't even searching for lake property when I found the listing. 3-bedroom house, private shoreline, old dock. The asking price was nearly 25% below market value. Normally that meant foundation problems, flooding, or terrible neighbors. The inspection found none of those. The house was solid. The roof was newer. No termites, no mold. Only one concern: the dock. The inspector walked halfway across it before shaking his head. "If you buy this place, don't trust this thing. It that bad? It needs rebuilding." That sounded expensive, but manageable. I figured I'd replace it before the following summer. I had no idea there was a difference between rebuilding a dock and removing one. Moving in took most of the weekend. Walter had taken almost everything, but little pieces of his life were still scattered around the house. An old fishing lure inside a kitchen drawer, a cracked coffee mug, a deck of worn playing cards tucked inside a cabinet. Nothing valuable. Just things too ordinary to pack. The dock, however, immediately became impossible to ignore. It stretched nearly 60 feet into Lake Martin. Every step made it groan. Several nails had worked their way upward over the years, and one support post leaned slightly toward the water. Late that first evening I walked to the very end and stood there watching the sunset disappear across the lake. The water was perfectly still. No boats. No voices. Just insects somewhere along the shoreline. For the first time in years, my mind felt completely quiet. I remember thinking I'd made the right decision buying that house. The next morning I met my closest neighbor, Frank Ellis. Retired firefighter, gray mustache, broad shoulders, the kind of man who smiled before introducing himself. He walked across the grass carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd need one." We sat on the porch talking for almost half an hour. He pointed out which houses belonged to retirees, which families only visited during summer, and which neighbor always had spare tools if something broke. It felt like exactly the kind of community I'd hoped to find. Then his eyes drifted toward the shoreline. "You planning to fix that dock? Eventually?" "It definitely needs work." He nodded once before adding, "Just don't remove it." I laughed. Walter told me the same thing. Frank didn't laugh back. He usually did. I waited for an explanation. None came. "So why?" He looked out across the lake for several seconds. Finally he sighed. "Not my story to tell." Then he stood, picked up his coffee cup, and headed home. Over the next few weeks I met nearly everyone on our stretch of shoreline. There were only 13 houses, and most of the families had known each other for decades. One neighbor invited me fishing. Another loaned me his riding mower. An elderly couple brought homemade peach pie the day after I finished unpacking. Every conversation ended almost the same way. "Welcome to the neighborhood. If you need anything, let us know." Then, almost as if they suddenly remembered something important, "Leave the old dock where it is." No explanation. No rumors. No stories. Just the same request. After hearing it 9 different times, it stopped feeling like coincidence. It felt rehearsed, as if everyone had agreed never to tell the new owner the whole truth. By the second month, I'd stopped asking questions. At least I tried to. Then the dock started making noises. Not ordinary creaks from old wood settling in the sun. These sounds came only after midnight. A dull metallic knock. Once, then silence. Sometimes another one, several minutes later. The first night I blamed the wind. The second night there wasn't any. By the fourth night, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and walked onto the dock. The lake was as smooth as glass beneath the moonlight. Every board groaned beneath my feet. Nothing seemed unusual. I reached the end, leaned over the edge and shined the light beneath the structure. Old pilings, cross braces, algae, nothing else. As I turned back toward the house, knock, I froze. The sound hadn't come from the water. It had come from directly beneath my feet. A hollow metallic strike, like steel being tapped with a hammer. I knelt, pressed my hand against the boards and listened. 30 seconds passed. Then, knock. Same place, same sound. This time I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was making that noise was somewhere under the dock. The following morning I mentioned the noise to Frank while he was watering flowers near the fence. "I heard something under the dock last night." He stopped what he was doing. "What kind of sound?" "Metal, like someone hitting steel with a hammer." For the first time since we'd met, he looked genuinely uneasy. "What time?" "A little after 1. He stared toward the lake before quietly saying, "Probably the old supports settling." "There aren't any metal supports." He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the hose again. "Don't worry about it." That response bothered me far more than the sound itself. A few days later, I hired a contractor named Mike to inspect the dock. He spent nearly an hour measuring beams, checking pilings, and photographing damaged boards before calling me over. "I've got good news. It can be saved?" He nodded. "You don't need a completely new dock." That's a relief. "The outer section definitely needs replacing." He walked toward the middle and stopped. "But this," he tapped one boot against the decking, "doesn't make sense." I stepped beside him. "What do you mean?" He pointed at a perfectly square section about halfway down the dock. "The rest of these boards are at least 40 years old. But these," he crouched and brushed dirt away from one of the bolts, "they're maybe 10 or 15. I looked closer. He was right. The wood was only slightly different in color. Enough that I'd never noticed it before. The hardware was newer too. Someone had carefully rebuilt one 8-foot square section right in the middle while leaving everything around it untouched. "You think it was storm damage?" Mike slowly shook his head. "If a storm had damaged this dock, the end would have taken the hit." He looked around again. "Nobody replaces the middle unless they have a reason." He raised the handle of his hammer and lightly tapped one of the boards. Knock. A deep metallic echo answered from underneath. Mike frowned. He tapped again. Knock. Same sound. Same hollow echo I'd heard after midnight. He looked directly at me. "That's not wood." "No, it isn't." He crouched lower and listened for another moment. "What do you have under there?" "I was hoping you could tell me." He stood, still staring at the square section. "I can pull these boards up. It'll take 20 minutes. I remembered Walter, then Frank, then every neighbor who'd repeated the same warning. Finally, I shook my head. "Not today." Mike nodded. "I think that's the right call." As he packed his tools, he paused beside his truck. "I've been building docks for 23 years. So, I've never seen anyone replace only the middle section." He glanced back toward the lake. "And I've definitely never heard a dock sound like that." That evening I walked back out alone. This time I wasn't looking underneath. I was looking at the boards themselves. That's when I noticed something I couldn't believe I'd missed for almost 3 months. Every board on the dock ran in the same direction, except 8. Exactly 8 boards. The ones forming that square section ran across the dock instead of along it. Not by accident. Deliberately. Whoever rebuilt that section wanted it to blend in just enough that most people would never notice. But if someone looked carefully, they'd realize it had been opened before. I suddenly remembered Walter's exact words. He had never said, "Don't rebuild the dock." He'd said, "Don't remove it." Those weren't the same thing. One meant repairs, the other meant uncovering whatever lay beneath. I barely slept that night. Every logical part of my brain told me to leave it alone. The engineer in me refused. Structures don't get rebuilt in the middle without a reason. 8 boards don't run in the wrong direction by coincidence. And entire neighborhoods don't repeat the same warning for 40 years because of sentiment. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. If there was nothing underneath, I'd put everything back exactly as I'd found it. No one would ever know. On Saturday morning, just after first light, I drove to the hardware store. I bought a pry bar, a socket wrench, and a cordless impact driver. Nothing destructive, just enough to remove 8 boards and finally learn why an old man had cared so much about a rotting dock. Saturday morning, the lake was almost perfectly still. A light mist drifted across the water, and not a single boat had left the marina yet. I carried my toolbox down to the dock, set it beside the square section, and looked around one last time. The neighbors' houses were quiet. No one appeared to be watching. I slipped the pry bar beneath the first board. Before I could lift it, a voice called from the shoreline. "Daniel!" I turned. Frank was standing near the fence. He wasn't angry. He looked disappointed. "I was hoping you wouldn't do this." I rested the pry bar on the deck. "You knew. I knew you'd eventually get curious. Then tell me what's under here." He slowly walked onto the dock until he stood a few feet away. "If I tell you, you'll think I'm crazy. I'll take that chance." He looked down at the square section. "Walter opened it once." "When?" "About 20 years ago." "What did he find?" Frank hesitated. "He never told me." "Then why are you trying to stop me?" "Because after he opened it, he spent the rest of his life making sure nobody else did." Those words hit harder than I expected. "If he found nothing, why protect it?" "I didn't say he found nothing." Before I could ask another question, Frank quietly stepped off the dock. "If you're going to ignore everyone's advice, at least don't do it alone." Then he walked back toward his house. I stood there another 10 minutes before picking up the impact driver. The first bolt came out easily, then the second. Within a few minutes, all 8 boards had been loosened. They weren't nailed down like the rest of the dock. They had been designed to come off. Someone had expected them to be opened again one day. I slid the first board aside. Beneath it wasn't water, it was steel. A thick rectangular metal plate sat between the wooden framing, completely hidden beneath the deck. Its edges were covered in old rubber seals, making it almost watertight. Near the center was a recessed lifting ring. I stared at it in disbelief. This wasn't part of the dock. It was a hatch. Before I touched it, another voice came from behind me. "I'd leave that exactly where it is." I spun around. An elderly woman I'd met only once stood at the entrance to the dock. Her name was Helen. She lived 2 houses farther down the shoreline. "I suppose Frank called you," she nodded. "He knew he couldn't stop you." She slowly walked closer, keeping her eyes fixed on the hatch. "Walter made every neighbor promise something before he sold the house. To protect this? Yes. Why? Because once it's opened, everything changes." I frowned. "You're all talking like there's treasure under here." Helen gave a sad smile. "I wish it were treasure." She reached into her jacket pocket and handed me a faded photograph. It showed the same dock more than 40 years earlier. The wood looked almost new. Walter stood near the shoreline beside 3 other men. Behind them, the square section had been removed. The steel hatch was open. One man was climbing out of it carrying a large metal box. I looked back at Helen. "When was this taken?" 1981. "So Walter really opened it?" She nodded. "That was the only time." "What was in the box?" "I don't know. He never told anyone." "What happened after that?" Helen looked toward the lake for several seconds before answering. "The next week, he rebuilt the dock. And he spent the next 40 years making sure nobody opened it again." I looked down at the steel hatch beneath my feet. Every answer I'd found only created 2 more questions. If Walter had already opened it, why seal it again? And why spend the rest of his life convincing strangers to leave it alone? I wrapped my fingers around the steel lifting ring. For a moment, I considered pulling. Then I stopped. Walter had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this place. If I was going to uncover it, I wanted to understand exactly what I was about to disturb. So instead of opening the hatch, I decided to find out what had happened in 1981. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the county records office. If Walter had discovered something in 1981, there had to be a reason he never spoke about it. An archivist helped me locate the original permits for the lake houses built along our cove. Most of the documents were exactly what I'd expected: property surveys, septic permits, dock approvals. Nothing unusual. Then one thin folder caught my attention. It contained a request Walter had filed less than 3 months after buying the property. The application wasn't to build a dock. It was to repair one. That didn't make sense. According to every neighbor, Walter had purchased the house in 1981, yet the dock already existed. Attached to the permit was a handwritten inspection note. Existing foundation, left undisturbed at owner's request. No explanation. Just that single sentence. On my way home, I stopped by Frank's house. He was sitting on the porch cleaning fishing reels. "You find anything?" "I found proof Walter rebuilt the dock." Frank nodded. "I know. But he specifically asked the county not to remove the original foundation." Frank stopped turning the reel. "He fought them over that." "Why?" "They wanted to replace everything." "And?" "Walter refused. He said if they touched the foundation, they'd destroy something that could never be replaced." I leaned against the porch railing. "What exactly?" Frank slowly shook his head. "I honestly don't know. I swear to you. He never trusted anyone with the full story. That evening Helen came by carrying an old cardboard box. "I think these belong to you now." Inside were photographs Walter had given several neighbors over the years. Most showed ordinary lake life: fishing trips, barbecues, 4th of July fireworks. But every few years another picture appeared. The dock. Always the dock. Walter standing in the same place, sometimes alone, sometimes with surveyors, sometimes with men in suits. The dock slowly aged. Walter grew older. Everything changed, except one thing. The square section in the middle never changed. Even when the rest of the dock was repaired, that section always looked exactly the same, almost as if Walter inspected it regularly. Near the bottom of the box I found a folded envelope. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a short handwritten note. "If you're reading this, curiosity has already won." There was no greeting, no signature, only a few lines. "The people around this lake kept my promise because they believed one day the right person would ask the right questions. If that's you, don't make your next decision alone." I looked up at Helen. "Did you know this was here?" She slowly nodded. "Walter gave me that envelope 5 years before he died. He said I'd know who deserved it. Why didn't you hand it to me sooner?" "Because until today, you were still trying to solve a mystery." She smiled gently. "Now you're trying to understand it." The following morning Mike drove back to the house. "I've been thinking about that hatch." "So have I." He set a toolbox on the porch. "I brought something." Inside was a portable lifting frame and a heavy-duty chain hoist. "If we're going to open it, we're doing it safely." Before I could answer, another truck pulled into the driveway. Then another. Frank stepped out of the first. Helen climbed out of the second. Behind them came Martha and 2 more neighbors I'd only spoken with a handful of times. I looked at Frank. "What's going on?" He smiled for the first time in days. "If you're going to open what Walter protected for 40 years, none of us are letting you do it by yourself." For the first time since buying the lake house, I realized something. The neighbors had never been trying to keep me away from the dock. They'd been waiting to see whether I was the kind of man Walter believed could be trusted with what lay beneath it. Together, we carried the lifting frame onto the dock. Mike anchored the chain hoist to 2 reinforced beams, while the rest of us stood back. No one spoke much. The only sounds were the soft clink of metal chains and the water moving gently beneath the pilings. Frank rested one hand on the railing. "Walter always said this day would come. You knew I'd eventually open it." He smiled. "No. I just knew nobody can live beside a mystery forever. The lifting hooks locked into the steel rings with a sharp click. Mike tested the tension. Ready? I looked around at the faces surrounding me. Frank, Helen, Martha. People who had protected this secret for decades without ever knowing exactly what it was. I nodded. Let's do it. Mike began turning the hoist. Nothing happened. Another few turns. Still nothing. Then a loud metallic pop echoed beneath the dock. The old rubber seal finally released. Slowly, the hatch began to rise. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. Mike lifted it only a foot before stopping. Flashlights. We all leaned closer. Instead of empty water beneath the dock, there was a narrow concrete chamber, perfectly dry, almost like a vault. In the center sat a large military green steel container. It was nearly 5 feet long with heavy carrying handles on both sides. Despite being hidden beneath the dock for decades, it showed almost no rust. Someone had maintained it. I climbed carefully into the chamber, while Mike handed me a flashlight. A small brass plate had been welded to one corner. Most of the lettering had worn away, but 3 words remained perfectly clear. U.S. Army property. Mike looked at me. That definitely wasn't built with the dock. No, it wasn't. The container wasn't locked, only sealed by 2 heavy steel latches, almost as though whoever placed it there wanted someone to open it, eventually. Before I reached for the latch, Frank quietly spoke. If you open that, there's no putting any of this back. I looked at him. You still want me to stop? He thought for several seconds before shaking his head. No. Walter protected it for 40 years. That doesn't mean he wanted it buried forever. Those words settled something inside me. I released the first latch, then the second. The airtight seal slowly separated with a soft hiss. Together, Mike and I lifted the lid. I expected stacks of money, gold, weapons, something dramatic. Instead, the container was filled from end to end with neatly organized waterproof archive boxes. Every one was labeled by hand. Every one numbered. On top rested a single large envelope. Across the front someone had written, "To whoever opened this." I carefully picked up the envelope. The paper was perfectly dry despite everything it had survived. Inside was a typed letter. No signature. No date. It began with one sentence. If you're reading this, then Walter trusted you more than he trusted anyone else. I glanced at Frank. You've never read this? He shook his head. He never let anyone open the container. I unfolded the remaining pages. Everything below belongs to the truth. Not to me, not to my family, and not to the people who spent 40 years trying to destroy it. My pulse quickened. I looked back into the container. One box read property transfers, another survey maps, then financial records, photographs, audio recordings, original contracts, dozens of archive boxes, thousands of documents. Walter hadn't hidden treasure beneath his dock. He'd hidden evidence. Evidence someone had spent decades making sure would never be found. As the realization settled over us, my phone suddenly vibrated. Unknown number. I answered. Before I could speak, a calm voice said, "You've opened it." It wasn't a question. "You still have time. Seal everything back up and walk away." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. Frank had already guessed what the caller said. His face turned pale. I was afraid of this. Afraid of what? He looked at the open container. They weren't waiting for Walter to die. They were waiting for someone else to finally find what he spent his life protecting. Frank was right. Less than 10 minutes after the phone call, 3 black SUVs turned onto the gravel road leading to my house. None had front license plates. None carried company logos. They stopped outside the gate as if the drivers already knew exactly where they were going. 4 men stepped out. The oldest wore a tailored gray suit and carried a leather briefcase. He smiled politely before speaking. "Mr. Brooks?" I didn't answer. He glanced toward the dock. "I believe you've discovered something that doesn't belong to you." He wasn't asking. He already knew. Frank quietly muttered, "They found it." The man walked closer, but stopped outside the gate. "My name is Charles Mercer. I represent a private investment group. I'm not interested. I think you will be." He opened the briefcase and removed a cashier's check. Already signed, only one line remained blank. The amount. He held out a pen. "Write whatever number you think is fair." I stared at him. "You want to buy a box of old documents?" Charles smiled. "I'd like to recover property that was taken without permission." Frank laughed bitterly. "You mean evidence?" Charles ignored him. "My offer expires today." I folded the check in half and handed it back. "No." His smile faded. "I expected that." He reached into the briefcase again. This time he removed several photographs. My truck, my office in Birmingham, my parents' house, even pictures of me unloading furniture during my first week at the lake. "They've been following me." Charles calmly nodded. "We've been evaluating risk." Frank stepped forward. "That's called stalking. I prefer preparation." He slipped the photographs back into the folder. "I'd hate for innocent people to become involved." The threat was polite, which somehow made it even worse. Before anyone could respond, the sound of sirens echoed from the road. 2 sheriff's deputies pulled into the driveway. Charles didn't seem surprised. In fact, he smiled. One deputy climbed out and greeted him by name. "Morning, Mr. Mercer." Frank leaned toward me. "Walter always said some people were on their payroll." The deputy walked over. "We received a complaint about unauthorized excavation." I pointed toward the dock. "I own the property." "I know." He lowered his voice. "But someone wanted us here." Charles adjusted his tie. "I simply thought everyone would be safer if law enforcement witnessed whatever happens next." He wanted witnesses, not protection. Everything changed because of Mike. Without saying a word, he picked up one of Walter's binders and handed it to the younger deputy. "Read the last page." The deputy frowned. "What am I looking for?" "The signature." He looked, then looked again. His expression completely changed. The signature belonged to Sheriff Robert Collins, his father. Page after page carried the same signature alongside county officials, surveyors and executives connected to shoreline developments stretching back nearly 40 years. The deputy slowly closed the binder. "Where did these come from?" "They were hidden beneath my dock." Charles took one small step backward. For the first time since arriving, he looked uncomfortable. The deputies immediately called for investigators. Within an hour, the property was surrounded by county vehicles and state investigators. Agent Laura Bennett from the Alabama Attorney General's office spent only a few minutes reviewing Walter's archive before looking up. "Whoever collected this spent decades building one of the most complete corruption cases I've ever seen." The documents revealed fraudulent shoreline purchases, shell companies, forged surveys, and illegal payments that reached far beyond Lake Martin. But Walter had left one final surprise. Tucked inside the last archive box was a cassette tape labeled only "Play This Last." Mike found an old cassette player in Walter's workshop. After a burst of static, Walter's calm voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, they finally found the archive." He paused. "I wasn't protecting these papers. I was protecting the confession." Another voice began speaking, confident, relaxed, describing in astonishing detail how officials had been bribed, homeowners pressured into selling, and millions of dollars in lakefront property quietly transferred through shell corporations. Agent Bennett immediately recognized the speaker. "The founder of Southeastern Shore Development." She looked around the room. "This recording changes everything." 3 months later, federal indictments began one after another. Executives, developers, lawyers, former county officials. More than 30 people were eventually charged. Walter's documents built the case. The confession proved it. The following spring, I rebuilt the dock exactly as I'd planned. New pilings, new decking, new railings. But I kept Walter's promise. The original foundation remained beneath the new structure, untouched. Near the entrance sits a small bronze plaque. It doesn't mention the investigation or the arrests. It simply reads, "In memory of Walter Green. He believed the truth was worth protecting." Sometimes visitors ask why part of the old dock still remains beneath the new one. I usually smile, look across the lake, and give them the same answer every time. The dock was never what needed protecting. Then I glanced toward the water beneath my feet. It was what one man trusted it to hide.